I tested every single beginner filmmaking camera to help you find the best ones. Finding the right camera can be frustrating because regular cameras simply lack the key features you need, and actual filmmaking cameras are very expensive. But if you know where to look, you can find a great camera that's also affordable. So in this video, I'm going to help you find the perfect camera for your style and budget so you can start making amazing films. Let's dive in. Also, I'll leave links down below for the best pricing on all of the cameras. Now, if you want something with more modern features that won't wreck your bank account, you should look at the Sony ZV-E1 Mark II. It has the same 26 megapixel APS-C size sensor from the very popular professional cinema camera, the Sony FX30, and it's half the price. It has a dual native ISO of 800 and 2500, which is excellent in low light, and it has a dynamic range of about 11 stops. The ZV-E1 II also is excellent when it comes to autofocus with face and eye tracking and is highly accurate. However, there is no in-body stabilization, which makes handheld shooting a bit challenging. There is digital stabilization, however, but it crops pretty heavily into the sensor. And if stabilization is critical for you, I have something amazing later on. The ZV-E1 also shoots 4K that is downsampled from 6K at 2430 and 60 frames per second. And by downsampling from 6K, you get a smaller and easier to edit 4K file, but it still has 6K detail. And it also supports 4K at 120 frames per second for slow motion, though there is a pretty big 1.6 times crop and it's pretty noisy even in bright light. Though everything is recorded in 10-bit 422 color with S-Log2, S-Log3, HLG, and S-Cinetone for enhanced dynamic range and color grading, this camera can literally deliver the same color grading results as a professional FX30. But if you're new to color grading, it also has cinematic vlog mode that adds black bars to the top and bottom of your image with a customizable cinematic filter for a polished video straight out of camera with very little work. Although one downside of the ZV-E1 Mark II is that it can overheat depending on your shooting environment. Usually you'll get about 73 minutes at 4K at 24 frames per second and 10 to 18 minutes at 4K at 60. But most of us aren't really shooting this long and it probably won't be an issue. But if you add a $50 fan accessory, most of these issues go away. And the ZV-E1 Mark II is also very small and light. It's only about 377 grams, and it's super easy to rig up for gimbals and handheld rigs because it's so small. And it also has a side articulating touchscreen that gives you control over all of your menus, major settings, and also touch autofocus. Now, despite the lack of IBIS in the ZV-E1 Mark II, it basically delivers the same results as the FX30 for half the price. For cinematographers, content creators who want pro-level features, but you're on a budget, the ZV-E1 Mark II is a phenomenal camera. Next up, let's talk about two cameras that are massively popular with both professional and beginner filmmakers because they offer professional grade features that even the more expensive cameras don't offer. And that is the Lumix S5 2X and its more affordable little brother, the Lumix S9. Both cameras share the exact same 24.2 megapixel full frame sensor that delivers stunning image quality with 12 stops of dynamic range that's pretty comparable to the Sony FX3, which is a $4,000 camera. And they both support 10-bit internal recording with high bitrate codecs, and they also have vlog color profile for cinematic color grading. And they both have a dual native ISO of 640 and 4000. And this actually outperforms the Sony FX30 and the ZV-E1 Mark II in low light performance. And the autofocus on both of these cameras is surprisingly reliable. In my opinion, it's very comparable and close to the Canon autofocus performance. And the stabilization is hands down the best in the camera industry right now. It's basically a gimbal. And the standout feature in both cameras is the ability to shoot 6K open gate at 24 and 30 frames per second. This squarish image allows you to shoot both vertical content and horizontal content at the same time. And open gate is also the best way to shoot anamorphic for that ultra cinematic look. However, one thing to note is that open gate only shoots 10-bit at 420 color, which isn't great for chroma key stuff like green screens, but other than that, you should be just fine. But it does shoot 10-bit 422 color when it comes to regular 4K at 2430 and 60 frames per second. One thing to note is that the 4K 60 does have a 1.6 times crop. Personally, I hate cropped 4K 60, but it may not matter to you depending on what you shoot. And for slow motion enthusiasts, the camera also does full HD up to 120 frames per second. The Lumix S5 2X does have a slight edge over the S9, and that is the ability to record Blackmagic RAW and 4K ProRes externally to a hard drive or an external recorder. This is probably not something most beginners are going to use. RAW takes up a lot of space, as does ProRes, but it's nice to know that this is a camera you can grow into. In terms of design, the Lumix S5 2X has a pretty typical camera design, but it does have discrete active cooling, making it a reliable choice if you plan on doing long takes. On the other hand, the Lumix S9 does have a smaller rangefinder style body, and the S9 can overheat. However, with the brand new update that just dropped, it can now record over an hour in any frame rate, which is a huge deal because when the S9 first came out, it could only do 10 to 15 minutes of recording tops. And they both use the same battery, which is pretty beefy. The reason both of these cameras are perfect for beginners is because they offer professional grade quality and tools normally found in pro cameras at a fraction of the price. Now, the next camera is actually cheaper than the Lumix cameras, but it has one very rare feature that might be a huge selling point for some of you. And this camera is the Canon R8. It has a 24.2 megapixel full frame sensor with about 11.1 stops of dynamic range. And it's actually the same sensor as the very popular Canon R6 Mark II, which I own and I absolutely love. It's going to give you absolutely gorgeous imagery, and it also has a beautiful triple ISO 800, 1600, and 3200, and even at 12,800, the image quality still looks amazing. Plus, it has an ultra-fast autofocusing system with AI subject detect, which is great for moving subject matter and is ultra reliable. However, it does not have in-body stabilization and only digital stabilization, but the crop isn't too bad in standard digital stabilization, but it's pretty heavy and enhanced. So something to watch out for if you shoot mostly handheld. The one feature that I absolutely love in this camera and the R6 Mark II, and might be the reason a lot of you guys pick this camera up, because it can shoot 4K at 24, 30, and 60 frames per second with no crop. And a full frame 4K 60p feature is super rare. The cameras that can do it are usually about $4,000 to $6,000. And the 4K video is also downsampled from 6K, so your 4K video really has the detail and quality of 6K. And it also has full HD at 180 frames per second for slow motion. And all of this is recorded in 10-bit 422 color in either HDRP-Q mode or C-Log 3, which allows for a professional level color grading and dynamic range. In terms of design, it's a very small and lightweight camera, and it's a really easy camera to rig up and turn into a proper cinema camera or put on a gimbal. And it also has a fully articulating touchscreen with touch autofocus, and this makes up for the lack of buttons on the camera. Sadly, the battery life on this camera is not great. It has a really small battery and it only lasts about 40 minutes of non-stop video, but that's probably enough for most people, but you should definitely buy a few spares. One downside of the Canon R8, and this is more of a Canon issue than a Canon R8 issue, is that Canon only lets you use Canon lenses for autofocus. However, they do have a pretty affordable range of primes and zooms for beginners, so you guys should be just fine, but I want choice and freedom. However, there's a really good case for buying this camera and just putting on cinema lenses. Overall, the Canon R8 is an incredible camera and it's worth picking up simply for the full frame 4K 60 at only about $1,000, despite the lock lens system. Now, before we talk about the absolute best camera on this list, I have to give a quick shout out to a camera you guys probably don't know about, and that is the Nikon Z6 III. And this is a legitimate professional camera that also comes at a pretty reasonable price, and within this price bracket, there's nothing else with specs like this. It has a 24 megapixel full frame sensor that's also partially stacked for very little rolling shutter. And the biggest thing about this camera is that it does Nikon RAW internally and has 10.5 stops of dynamic range, with a dual native ISO of 800 and 6400. And in terms of autofocus, it's about as good as the Lumix S5 2X. It shoots 6K raw video internally up to 60 frames per second, or 4K up to 60 frames per second that is also downsampled from 6K. Or it can do ProRes 422HQ in very similar 4K downsampled frame rates. But the RAW and ProRes files are massive, and you need to spend at least another $1,000 on cards and hard drive space to store all the data. The Z6 III can shoot H.265, but the main reason to get this camera is really the raw video. If you're ambitious and very serious about your filmmaking, the Z6 III is definitely a camera you should check out. So what is the absolute best camera for beginner filmmakers that want to get the best value for their money, but they're not necessarily on a super tight budget? That camera is without a doubt the Sony ZV-E1. It features the exact same 12 megapixel full frame sensor as the FX3 and delivers identical image quality and the same 12.5 stops of dynamic range, plus the same outstanding low light performance with a dual native ISO of 800 and 12,800 in S-Log3. However, it has a newer processor, which gives the Sony ZV-E1 improved autofocus with subject AI detection for people, animal, cars, airplanes, and much more. The autofocus is incredibly accurate, and I've actually shot several music videos with this camera, and it's performed flawlessly. The autofocus is actually better than the FX3, and the ZV-E1 is one of the few cameras that actually has 5-axis in-body stabilization, and you can also add digital stabilization on top of the 5-axis stabilization for amazing handheld results. But it's not as good as the Lumix S5 2X. In terms of frame rates, it shoots 4K at 24, 30, and 60 frames per second with no crop, full frame, and 4K at 120 frames per second with a very minimal 5% crop. And these frame rates are going to let you shoot anything you want with this camera, from music videos to short films to even commercials. And all of this is recorded in 10-bit 422 color with cinematic color profiles like S-Log3, HGL, and S-Cinetone. And if you're new to color grading, just like the ZV-E10 Mark II, it also has cinematic vlog mode that allows you to get polished video straight out of the camera with very little work. Now, of course, there are some trade-offs. The ZV-E1 has more of a content creator and vlogger style body, but it's just as easy to use as the FX3, it's just a smaller body. One thing to note is that the ZV-E1 does not have a cooling fan, so overheating can occur. You'll get about 1 hour in 4K at 24 frames per second and 30 to 40 minutes in 4K at 60 or 120 frames per second. However, if you simply add a $50 fan on the back, most of these problems go away. And the ZV-E1 doesn't support external RAW recording like the FX3, but that's a feature most of you guys won't need. The battery life is excellent because it actually uses the exact same battery as the FX3, allowing for at least an hour of continuous recording. The ZV-E1 basically gives you the performance of a $4,000 camera for half the price without missing any key features that filmmakers need, and whatever it doesn't have, you probably don't need at a beginner level. And if you want to make sure you get the best pricing on all of the cameras we talked about today, check out the links in the description down below, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.